Welcome to our lesson on the BCBA 6th edition task list. This is original BCBA exam practice, not official BACB exam content. We will first learn how to read a task as an action, evidence target, and boundary, then work through 8 scenario questions. The point is not to memorize domain letters. It is to recognize the exact job of verb requests and avoid options that answer a different job. Our free BCBA mock exam is waiting on screen. This lesson is about a problem that appears across the BCBA exam. The candidate knows several true facts, but the task asks for one specific action. We will read the 6th edition task list as a decision structure: verb, target, evidence, and boundary. The 8 questions move across definition, measurement, selection, evaluation, assessment, documentation, visual analysis, and implementation. The confusing part is not deliberately difficult English. It is that an option can be professionally reasonable while answering a different verb, skipping a required step, or adding evidence the STEM never supplied. The payoff is a portable reading move. Identify the exact job the task requests before you choose a familiar label. The practical promise is simple. When the wording changes, our reading routine still works because it follows the evidence rather than the surface vocabulary. The practical promise is simple. When the wording changes, our reading routine still works because it follows the evidence rather than the surface vocabulary. Let's begin with the boundary that makes the rest of the lesson easier to read. Every task list item contains a decision structure. Read the action verb first, then identify the target and the boundary around the action. The task list habit is to let the verb set the scope. For example, the left side includes define, measure, select, evaluate, implement, while the right side includes name what the action applies to. In a real STEM, that difference tells you which facts to keep and which facts would be a category error. The contrast is not that one side is always better. It is that the verb determines the type of evidence, whereas notice context, sequence, and safety limits. The split on the slide is therefore a boundary, not a ranking. Keep this rule in view. Verb first, target second, evidence third. Once the boundary is clear, the next step is to follow the decision from beginning to end. Task verbs are not interchangeable. The same case can require a definition, a measurement, or a decision depending on one word. In the exam, the task verb limits which evidence counts. For a concrete case, follow the sequence shown here. First, define, set observable boundaries. Then, measure, collect data with a stated system. Finally, select, match a procedure to the decision. If the first step is skipped, the final label may look polished, but it is not supported by the process. The nearest error is jumping from define, set observable boundaries straight to evaluate. Compare evidence with a criterion without checking the middle relation. The latter is showing dependency. Each later move relies on the earlier evidence. Keep this rule in view. Name the verb before you name the answer. Here the risk is not forgetting a definition. It is crossing a boundary the STEM has not crossed. Data, interpretation, and intervention are different jobs. A task may mention all 3, but the requested action controls the answer. The domain may orient you, but the verb still controls the job. For example, operational definition belongs on one side of the boundary, while interpret the pattern belongs on the other. The question is not which phrase sounds more clinical. It is what changed in the relation or decision. That is why what job matters. A shared word or setting does not erase the difference between measurement procedure and choose or modify a procedure. The 2 panels are meant to be read together. Name the signal and the limit before you generalize. Keep this rule in view. Do not jump to a decision before the task asks for it. Think of this visual as a route map from evidence to a defensible label. Domains organize the context, not the answer by themselves. A domain clue narrows the field, but the task verb and evidence still decide the response. The task list habit is to let the verb set the scope. For example, trace the route from foundations. Name the scientific frame through measurement. Define and quantify to supervision. Document and monitor. If one link is missing, the map may suggest a possibility, but it cannot prove the stronger claim. The nearest mistake is treating every connected item as equivalent. The route matters. The relation or source changes at each node. The map keeps the inference local, so we do not let one vivid detail decide the whole scenario. Keep this rule in view. Domain is a locator. The task verb is the selector. Use this table to compare the job each term performs, not just the words used to name it. The exam changes one verb and changes the work. Use the smallest evidence set that completes the requested task. In the exam, the task verb limits which evidence counts. For example, the table separates define, observable boundaries, giving a cause from measure, data procedure, giving an opinion. That comparison is useful because the same case can contain familiar vocabulary while the requested job changes. Read the middle column as the answer fit and the final column as the near miss. The exam is asking you to preserve the feature in the first column, not to choose the most familiar term. The matrix is a decision aid. It keeps the target, the fit, and the trap in the same frame. Keep this rule in view. The correct answer completes the exact verb. Follow the events from left to right, because the same words can mean different things in a different position. Turn a long stem into 4 short questions. The order prevents a plausible but misaligned answer. The domain may orient you, but the verb still controls the job. Picture the sequence in a real case. 1. What action verb is explicit? 2. What evidence is supplied? 3. What evidence is missing? 4. What is the narrowest defensible move? The order tells you whether a detail is an antecedent, a response, a consequence, or a later judgment. A later outcome cannot be moved backward in the sequence just because it sounds important. Keep the start point, the observed event, and the comparison point in their original positions. The timeline is doing the reasoning work that a dense paragraph often hides. Keep this rule in view. Reduce the stem without erasing its boundary. This is where the close distractors become useful. Each one preserves part of the truth, but breaks the controlling relation. Most task list distractors are true somewhere else. Reject an option when it solves a different task, skips a required step, or adds missing evidence. The task list habit is to let the verb set the scope. Consider the first 2 near misses. True is not equal to responsive. A true statement can answer another verb. Then domain is not equal to decision. A domain label does not choose the action. Each contains a piece of a true idea, but each fails to preserve the relation the stem actually supplies. When a distractor sounds reasonable, ask what it assumes, what it leaves out, and which different question it would answer. That is more reliable than rejecting it by label alone. The trap map is a visual list of broken links between evidence and answer. Keep this rule in view. Alignment is the exam skill. Verb, target, evidence, boundary. The final page turns the distinction into a short reading routine for a new stem. Use the same reading routine on a new task. A task list becomes useful when it changes how you read unfamiliar stems. In the exam, the task verb limits which evidence counts. In a fresh case, apply the routine in order. Circle the action verb. Underline the evidence target. Cross out assumptions not in the stem. Answer the narrowest supported action. For instance, mark the decision word before you let a familiar concept take over. The nearest error is treating the routine as a vocabulary quiz. It is a way to protect the evidence while the surface details change. The stacked steps give you a portable sequence rather than another definition to memorize. Keep this rule in view. Read the task as an action, not as a vocabulary quiz. Before the first question, use 4 passes. Isolate the clue that changes the decision. Name the relation, history, measure, implementation issue, or sequence being tested. Test every option against that clue, rejecting any answer that adds missing evidence or solves a different problem. Then state the portable rule in your own words. We will read the complete stem and all 4 options, pause before the reveal, announce the correct answer once, and explain every distractor in relation to this exact case. Question 1. A task list item asks the BCBA to measure a client's hand raising during 3 classroom activities. Which action best matches the verb in the task? A. Operationally define the response and collect data using a stated measurement system. B. Define hand-raising in broad, everyday language. C. Select the most intensive intervention before collecting baseline. D. Ask the teacher whether hand-raising seems improved. Pause and name the decisive relation before you choose. Choose A. Operationally define the response and collect data using a stated measurement system. The verb is measure, so the action must produce observable data under a defined system. Operational definition plus a planned data system is the direct way to measure the target. The other actions either stay vague, skip baseline, or rely on opinion. What makes this tricky is that a familiar professional action can still answer the wrong task verb. B. A broad description does not create a reliable measurement system. C. Intervention selection is a later decision and cannot replace measurement. D. A teacher report may inform assessment, but it is not the requested measurement action. When a task says measure, identify the observable response, the unit, and the data procedure. Question 2. A candidate reads, define the target behavior. Which response best demonstrates completion of that task? A. Explain why the behavior probably occurs. B. State observable onset and offset criteria that distinguish the behavior from similar events. C. Graph the behavior across treatment phases. D. Recommend extinction because the behavior is dangerous. Hold the labels for a moment. Match the evidence to the options. The strongest answer is B. State observable onset and offset criteria that distinguish the behavior from similar events. Defining requires observable boundaries that allow two observers to identify the same event. A measurable definition specifies what counts and what is not. Rationale, graphing, and treatment choice are different tasks. The STEM does not support the idea that the option that sounds most clinical may still skip the exact verb. A. A causal explanation is not an operational definition. C. Graphing uses data but does not define the response itself. D. An intervention recommendation skips the definitional step. Define the behavior before measuring or changing it. Question 3. A task asks the BCBA to select a measurement procedure for tantrums that vary in duration and intensity. What must the answer first match? A. The supervisor's favorite graph type. B. The intervention with the strongest marketing claim. C. The behavior's measurable dimension and the decision the data must support. D. The client's diagnosis alone. Choose the answer that the exact STEM supports, not the one that sounds most familiar. On this STEM, select C. The behavior's measurable dimension and the decision the data must support. Selection is justified by fit between the target dimension, measurement procedure, and decision. The best procedure captures the feature that matters for the clinical question. Preferences, marketing, or diagnosis alone do not establish fit. Watch the near miss. A true statement about a procedure can still be the wrong selection criterion. A. Preference does not establish measurement validity. B. Marketing claims do not identify the target dimension. D. Diagnosis alone cannot select a measurement system for an individual behavior. Select the procedure that fits the behavior dimension and the decision, not the label or preference. Question 4. A BCBA is asked to evaluate whether a teaching procedure improved independent requests. Which evidence is most responsive to that task? A. A single successful trial after coaching. B. A staff member's belief that the procedure feels effective. C. The number of pages in the treatment manual. D. Repeated independent request data compared with the relevant baseline or criterion. Before the reveal, ask what the STEM proves and what it leaves unknown. The evidence supports D. Repeated independent request data compared with the relevant baseline or criterion. Evaluation requires evidence of change against a meaningful comparison, not one anecdote or an opinion. Repeated data interpreted against baseline or stated criterion support an evaluation of effect. The other options do not establish change. The distractor quietly assumes that the most positive-looking data point is not automatically an evaluation. A. One trial cannot establish a reliable change. B. Staff belief is not outcome evidence. C. Manual length says nothing about client improvement. Evaluate by comparing repeated outcome data with a baseline, criterion, or expected pattern. Question 5. The task says to conduct a functional behavior assessment for task refusal. Which action is most defensible first? A. Collect and integrate relevant indirect and direct assessment information. B. Choose a function solely from the diagnosis. C. Start with punishment so refusal stops quickly. D. Ask one person for a label and end the assessment. Take a second pass. What must be true for each option to win? This question resolves to A. Collect and integrate relevant indirect and direct assessment information. Conducting the assessment means gathering and integrating information about antecedents, consequences, and context. A functional behavior assessment is a process. Multiple evidence sources are integrated before a function-based decision. The tempting error is that the question asks for the assessment action, not the final intervention label. B. Diagnosis does not identify the maintaining variable by itself. C. An intervention should not be selected before the assessment supports it. D. One report is insufficient for a defensible assessment. Conduct means carry out the assessment process and integrate evidence before deciding. Question 6. A supervision task asks the BCBA to document a change to a protocol after a safety concern. What belongs in the record? A. Only the final outcome percentage. B. The change, reason, relevant risk, and follow-up plan. C. A private opinion about the staff member's character. D. A promise that no future change will occur. Pause and name the decisive relation before you choose. Choose B. The change, reason, relevant risk, and follow-up plan. Documentation must make the decision and its safety rationale traceable. Recording what changed, why it changed, the risk considered, and how it will be monitored supports continuity and accountability. What makes this tricky is that a concise note can be incomplete if it hides the decision path. A. An outcome percentage alone does not explain the decision. C. Character judgments are not a professional record of the protocol change. D. Absolute promises do not document the actual risk decision. Document the decision, rationale, risk, and follow-up, not just the result. Question 7. A data display shows a sharp level change after a new teaching procedure, but the next 3 sessions are highly variable. Which analysis is most appropriate? A. Conclude mastery from the first high point. B. Ignore the phase change because variability is present. C. Describe the level change and examine variability before judging stability. D. Replace the procedure without reviewing implementation. Hold the labels for a moment. Match the evidence to the options. The strongest answer is C. Describe the level change and examine variability before judging stability. Visual analysis requires considering level and variability together. The initial change does not establish a stable effect. A level shift is important, but high variability limits confidence until the pattern is examined across sessions. The STEM does not support the idea that one visible feature can be real and still insufficient for the conclusion. A one high point does not establish mastery. B. Variability is part of the analysis, not a reason to ignore the phase change. D. Replacement is premature without checking implementation and the full pattern. Analyze each relevant dimension and state what the data do and do not support. Question 8. A protocol task says to implement a function-based intervention with fidelity. Which action best fits the task? A. Deliver only the preferred component and omit the measurement plan. B. Change the function-based consequence whenever staff are busy. C. Ask the client whether the protocol sounds reasonable and stop there. D. Follow the defined components as written, record deviations, and seek supervision when limits arise. Choose the answer that the exact STEM supports, not the one that sounds most familiar. On this STEM, select D. Follow the defined components as written, record deviations, and seek supervision when limits arise. Implementation requires delivering the defined intervention components and responding transparently to deviations or competence limits. Following the plan, recording deviations, and using supervision protects both treatment integrity and client safety. Watch the near miss. A flexible tone does not authorize undocumented changes to a function-based plan. A. Omitting components changes the intervention and hides implementation failure. B. Unplanned changes can break the function-based relation. C. Acceptability feedback is useful but does not complete implementation. Implement the defined relation, document deviations, and escalate competence or safety limits. We are halfway. The first questions separated define, measure, select, and evaluate. The second half adds conduct, document, analyze, and implement, where a reasonable action can still be out of sequence. If you missed one, ask which evidence the verb requires and which assumption the distractor adds. Keep the routine, verb, target, evidence, boundary. Across these 8 questions, the durable move is alignment. Define means set observable boundaries. Measure means use a data system. Select means match a procedure to the decision. Evaluate means compare repeated evidence. Implement means deliver the defined relation and monitor limits. A domain label narrows context, but does not choose the answer by itself. On a new stem, circle the verb, name the target, list the evidence, and reject any option that adds missing facts or skips the sequence. If this lesson helped, keep practicing with our free BCBA mock exam for time questions. Then use our quick study guide to review the relation behind each miss. The links are shown on screen. Subscribe, share the item that made you pause, and return for the next lesson. We are building a clearer BCBA exam library one deciding detail at a time. Use our quick study guide for a slower pass through the definitions, contrasts, examples, and exam traps from this lesson. The complete guide link is shown on screen, and the free BCBA mock exam is ready when you want to test transfer. We're building a clearer study routine together.